Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today I've got a first look for you at an upcoming Tier 8 Premium Soviet Heavy Tank. Yeah, as if we needed more of those going into the game. That has just reached the super test. Now, full disclosure, statistics are subject to change. This is an initial idea of what the vehicle could be, but I think it's an exciting one to be able to talk about, as are usually all of the tanks with object in their name. The Object 259A is a prototype build for an IS-7, which means that you can look forward to a pike nose, a cast streamlined turret, and very well angled side armor, and it looks like this thing is going to go very quickly as well. So before I dig into the statistics, let's take a look at the pictures that Wargaming have provided us, and maybe we can have an idea of how the armor layout is going to be. Well, firstly, oh, thank goodness, this thing's going to have a bit of a weak point on top that immediately means that it's not going to be just like an IS-7 where it gets to sit, hold down, and be impervious. I remember a hilarious video that Wargaming released where they had Object 27, oh, I don't know, not that, this is the object. They had Waffenträger auf E100s shooting at an IS-7 across Malinovka, and none of them were able to penetrate, even firing gold rounds. That's just how awesome that turret is. From above, the armor kind of looks a lot like an IS-5, well, as you would expect, considering that this is an IS-7 prototype, or something like a Defender. It's going to be all about trying to keep that pike frontal onto your opponents, try and keep your opponent at some kind of a sweet spot where they're about 10 or 15 meters away from you, and hope that they try to aim down at your lower hull or the lower plate, and it should bounce. Same angle from there, from the back, the hull, yeah, looks truly Soviet, and the shape of the turret does remind me more of a Defender from that kind of an angle. A slight slant at the back of the turret, which might help you ricochet if you're caught out from lower tier tanks at half decent distances. And it's very interesting the way that the turret kind of bows out here for where the hatch is on top of the tank. Ooh, from the side, this might give us a better idea. So it looks to me like this will be angled armor that goes back on in itself. I doubt that this part will be flat, but I could be wrong. Usually this is space protection that protects angled armor that goes in, and this thing looks like it might have more of an Object 257 kind of hull, which would make sense considering this thing is called the Object 259A, suggesting it's somewhere between the 257 and the IS-7. Although when you think about it, the 257 is the tier 9 heavy tank, right? Which makes this thing's hull armor seem pretty darn scary. Not too much more that we can really deduce apart from here. This is important. We see that there are welds going along the hull here. That suggests to me that all of this part is just mounting points for the tracks, and it might not even count as the hull armor, suggesting that the lower plate is actually going to be quite a small V down here. But again, I'm only guessing, I could be wrong. And all in all, it looks very similar, as we can see here, to the armor of the 257. And if that's the case, when we turn it to a live model, you can see that this whole area is just where the tracks are mounted. And my guess is that the side armor on this vehicle is going to work a lot like the 257, where you can over-angle it and you still don't get penned all along the lower part of the hull, making this thing a voracious reverse side scraper, or just something that's kind of idiot proof and will take a lot of punishment from a lot of different angles. But just having a good armor layout doesn't matter if you don't have the statistics to be able to back it up. And in true QuickyBaby fashion, I've taken all of the statistics of the 259A so we can compare it to two of its competitors at tier 8 premium heavy, the IS-5 and the 252U. So immediately we notice that the 259A has a 122mm caliber gun, a lot like all of these tanks, with 420 alpha damage. I believe this will be the first tank in the game that has 420 alpha damage, putting it right in between the IS-5 and the 252U, which have 390 and 440. It's a darn healthy alpha damage for tier 8, and suggests to me just how much Wargaming are trying to balance out this vehicle, trying to push these tier 8 premiums to the limit. They're getting as close to tier 9 tanks as you possibly could ever get. And one thing that rocks about this tank is the penetration. 233 on its standard ammunition, which are actually APCR rounds on this vehicle, as we can see here, and they do have a very good shell velocity, which should allow this thing to be able to clutch shot at tanks at decent distances, although as we're going to see with the gun handling, it's not really meant to be a sniper. One thing that rocks about this vehicle as well is the 285mm of high explosive anti-tank penetration. That's 20 more than the 252U and 15 more than the IS-5. I used to think that 270 heat at Tier 8 Premium was amazing, but now with vehicles like the 122 going into the game that has 299, I believe, and this one, which is going to be, if statistics stay the same, going in with 285, that's awesome for being able to just bludgeon your way through Tier 9 and Tier 10 tanks, or just to treat Tier 8 and below vehicles with disregard for how good their armor is. So, fortunately, for everyone who was worried about the balance of this vehicle so far, the damage per minute is looking quite lackluster. It's worse than the Defender, which doesn't have very good DPM, massively worse than the IS-5. It's only just a little bit better than the T-34 and the Lerva. That means that this vehicle is going to struggle with all-in engagements, and considering that its alpha damage is not as good as the Defender, it might actually struggle with trying to find a spot to be able to trade effectively. But that doesn't seem to really happen with the T-34, and that's got less alpha damage than this and less DPM, so I think it should still be alright. So now onto the gun handling, and all of these vehicles have horrific gun handling. This vehicle actually has the best accuracy in the comparison at 0.42, but I don't think anyone's ever going to pretend that 0.42 is actually any good. The aim time is the same across the board at 3.2 seconds, and the depression is 6 degrees for this tank, which is nice, the same as the IS-7, for example, but not quite as good as the relatively recently buffed IS-5 at 7. That should mean that this thing is still going to struggle on a ridgeline, but it's not as if it's got 5 degrees of gun depression where it would truly struggle. The elevation, 16 degrees, fairly normal. The turret traverse on this tank is 29. That's just a little bit better than all of the other tanks. And when we take a look at the dispersion values, which Wargaming have given us, which is very useful, we can take a look and see that the gun handling is not very good on this tank. 0.24 when moving and when turning the hull, and 0.12 when turning the turret. That means that you're going to really have to use vertical stabilizers on this tank unless you want to have horrific bloom. Absolutely horrific bloom on this tank. And the issue is, as we look at the mobility, do you really have a slot to be able to give up to use vertical stabilizers, because you're probably going to want to boost the performance of the engine of this tank. Look at this mobility. This thing goes at 60 kilometers an hour forwards. That's actually the same as the weight of this tank, which is 60 tons, as I was highlighting the wrong part of the vehicle. That is so much better than the 252U, which is limited at 35, and makes even the fast IS-5 look silly at 42 kilometers an hour. This thing is looking as close as an IS-7 at Tier 8 as Wargaming can possibly squeeze it. However, with a power to weight ratio of 15 and ground resistances which are worse than the other two tanks on this comparison across medium and soft terrain, this thing is never going to be able to get up to its 60 kilometer an hour top speed limit unless you significantly upgrade the mobility of this tank. We're talking about off-road driving, we're talking about improving the ground resistances using the second field module, we're talking about maybe even using a turbo or probably even grousers on this tank. But if you don't use a turbo, then the reverse speed on this tank, which is only 12 kilometers an hour, will likely really hold you back. This is going to be the kind of tank that scales very well with somebody who has all of the field mods, who has multiple equipment loadouts, who has a very good crew with a very good driver. And if you manage to get all of those things, this thing could be an all-purpose kind of heavy tank, more like a medium, a lot like people are playing the IS-7, the 260 at Tier 10, that wants to rush into position, have armor that can be able to bludgeon its way through all of the medium tanks, can stop the light tanks from holding those positions, or even just be the first heavy into a position to be able to set the tempo by getting that initial shot into your opponents while they're still trying to contest those locations. As everyone will know, having speed in World of Tanks allows you to dominate some of the most important locations of the map, and the 259A looks like it's going to be the Tier 8 heavy tank for being able to do that. But just the fact that it's got horrible dispersion values, poor accuracy, bad aim time, and also bad DPM kind of makes me wish that it had about 4 or 5 equipment slots on this tank to be able to really harness some of the vehicle's stronger attributes. So all of this wouldn't mean anything if the vehicle wasn't well armored, and yes it is. It's got 110 millimeters of frontal hull armor, 100 on the side, 90 at the rear. Now, the frontal hull armor is 10 meters worse than the IS-5 that I don't think anyone thinks has an amazing lower plate, but its upper plate is very decent, especially when you're using the gun depression, and it's 20 worse than the Defender. So it doesn't look like this thing is going to be just that outrageous apocalypse tank that can just expose its armor to everyone. Although, as I showed, with the fact that its hull armor looks a lot like a 257, you might be able to over-angle this one, unlike the IS-5, and, well, I was going to say unlike the 252U, but that thing does pretty well when it's angled as well. But the main difference in design with this vehicle, and I'm just theory crafting here, is that it's most likely to have a complete angled hull, as we saw from the armor, whereas the 252U, as we can see, doesn't have those welds along the front and has flat side armor that is traditionally pennable. Another thing that we should mention is that the 257 isn't actually trackable and damageable. And while players at tier 9 might be able to figure out, oh, okay, I just don't shoot the front or I don't shoot the rear of the tracks of the 257, with the 259A, which will play against tier 6 and tier 7 and tier 8 tanks, they might not have a clue. Think it comes around the corner, try and shoot its tracks. It doesn't do anything because it doesn't actually hit the hull. And they're going to have to figure out to shoot the upper hull armor like on the 257. One thing I'd like to highlight is that the 257, when it angles like this, it has 130 millimeters of upper hull armor, but that only actually gives it 220 millimeters of effective protection. And remember that this tank, the 259A, has 100 millimeters, and so its effective armor could drop as low as about 180 when it's angling like this. So it's really going to have to try and side scrape, bait its opponents into shooting at the side of its hull, and then start to dominate the position against them. Turret armor-wise, this vehicle's got a fabulous 260 on the front and 155 at the side. We're going to have to see how weak that weak point is on top of the vehicle, because if it's very thin and pennable by tier 6 and tier 7s, this thing could be a little bit of a clunker. However, it could be thick and flat, a lot like on an ST1, for example, and if that is the case, then it's only going to be a clunker inside a bad matchup against high explosive anti-tank rounds. The hit points on this vehicle are rather disappointing at 1,450, making this thing a lot more fragile than other tier 8 heavy tanks. But one thing that is crazy about this tank, and obviously subject to change, is its 380 meters view range. This is one of the biggest bonuses of the tank, that it has 20 more than the IS-5 and 30 more than the 252U. This means that this tank has more view range than the 122, for example, that's gone into the game. And so, with decent cruise skills, premium consumable, you will be able to reach about 450, maybe 460 meters view range with this tank with the correct field mod. And that will allow this thing to spot in forward positions, unlike a lot of other Soviet heavy tanks can. And when you look at how decent the armor might be and the fact that it's got a pretty darn good selection of ammunition, I can imagine this thing rushing forwards, getting into a position, and then just nobody wanting to take the risk to be able to dig it out, especially inside a nice matchup. All in all, the 259A is looking like yet another exciting premium tank to go into the game. And I think that that's really what Wargaming's issue is now, that they have so many exciting premium tanks going into the game that for one to actually be exciting at tier 8, it has to push the boundaries of balance. When we take a look at some of these statistics on this tank, it just doesn't really look like a heavy tank to me. You know, why should it be able to go at 60 kilometers an hour while also still having the view range? These are statistics that medium tanks are meant to fulfill on the battlefield, and why do we have so many heavy tanks going into the game that are just becoming these all-purpose meta vehicles? And anyone who's played ranked will definitely notice that it's basically become a two-class race, maybe with the occasional tank destroyer or light tank kind of propping it up. And the more that we have all-purpose tanks like this going into the game that can play that medium tank role, but still definitely have the armor to be able to back up pushing into an aggressive position, the more that we're going to see medium tanks and light tanks just become more and more redundant. All in all, the 259A is definitely one to keep your eyes on, purely from the fact that the fastest heavy tanks in the game are currently vehicles like the AMX 5100, which are limited to 51 kilometers an hour. This thing, when set up with a turbo, for example, will be able to achieve speeds of 65 kilometers an hour, which will actually make it one of the faster medium tanks at tier 8 in the game as well. Of course, if this thing maintains its current statistics, and as Wargaming clearly highlight, the characteristics are not final. Although, I don't really feel like they even changed too much after they've gone to the super test these days. Anyway, ladies and gents, boys and girls, that was it for the Object 259A. Let me know what you think about the tank in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you felt like I did a good job. If you hated it, however, give it a thumbs down. But as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.